Hi, I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge, and welcome to another edition of Half Hour on the Hill. I'm very honored to be joined today by someone that I've respected for a very long time and a longtime friend, Bob Van Meter, a founder and the chair of Acton Housing for All and the vice chair of the Acton Community Housing Corporation. So Bob, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Senator. It's great to be here today.
I know we were talking a little bit earlier. I remember when I joined the Acton Housing Authority when I was a legal aid attorney. I believe at that time you were the executive director of Alston Brighton CDC.
That's right.
Yep.
I spent 15 years as the executive director of the Alston Brighton Community Development Corporation, which is a community-based housing developer and community organization in the Alston Brighton neighborhood of Boston, and we developed about 400 units of affordable housing while I was there, and they're still going strong, which makes me very happy that the organization is still thriving and providing housing for folks in Alston Brighton. And then I remember, I think it was even before you had started, or maybe you were in law school at Boston College at the time when we first met.
Yep.
And you were exploring ways for Boston College students to get involved in affordable housing, and I think you
that's right.
set up a clinic at BC.
Yep, Community Development Clinic. Yep, that's right.
Yeah. As things turn, I'm now teaching affordable housing to undergraduate students at Boston College.
Oh, that's
in
excellent.
addition to my other roles. So yeah, it's great how much interest there is among undergraduates in this issue in a way that really wasn't the case 30 years ago or 25 years ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you teach affordable housing, I mean, I always get overwhelmed by the technical details about how to build affordable housing, to make the finances work. Is it that, or is it other aspects of bigger sort of social policy?
It's both, actually. Yeah. So it's kind of a public policy course, a little bit of a history course, and try and give the students a taste of the mechanics of how you build affordable housing. So last evening, the students were divided into teams of 4, and I gave them each a scenario and had them create the financial model for their housing project, as well as research the community needs, the politics of housing. So one scenario was to build a 40B development in Arlington, Mass. Another was to do an elderly housing, all affordable development in Alston Brighton, and a third was to do a family development in Roxbury. And so they had to come up with the financing mechanisms. They got a spreadsheet that had some of the formulas already in it.
Right.
But they learned something about what are the tools, what are the financial tools that we have now, and the fact that it's hard to do. It's hard to make housing affordable, and it's hard to get it built as well. Both of those things are true. And there was a lot of coverage of those issues in the national press in the last few months, but also in the last few years, actually, since the pandemic began.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think there was just a Boston Globe story a week or two ago about the lives of individuals, families, especially I think a lot of immigrant families, struggling to find even a tiny apartment in the Boston area. So,
yep. No, it's true. Boston is one of the places in the country that's most difficult to afford housing and most difficult to find housing. And I think the reasons for that are, there's more than one reason, but one of the reasons is that Massachusetts cities and towns make it difficult to build. And one of the ways they make it difficult to build is with zoning restrictions, which is kind of a major block to housing. Some people have called it the paper wall of zoning.
So this is the requirements for 1 or 2 acre zoning, no multifamily or no denser housing zoning.
Yes, so single family zoning, yes, 1 acre, 2 acre, lots of different restrictions. And I think one of the things that many people don't know is that a lot of the restrictions that are part of our zoning codes really grew out of efforts to exclude people from communities. In the early 20th century, when zoning codes were being adopted by cities and towns, in many cases, single-family zoning was seen as a way to keep African Americans out of communities, a way to keep immigrants out of communities. And if you didn't allow multifamily housing, you wouldn't have African American people moving into your community or your neighborhood. And so we are living with the legacy of racial discrimination in zoning, because even though we're not explicitly excluding those people, our zoning codes function in many ways to do that as well.
And I think you make the point about the barrier to home ownership for African Americans, other people of color, often working class people in general, is that automatically, for most Americans or those who are homeowners, their major asset, their major equity is that home. And if you don't have that, then you can't borrow money to send your kids to college or other
or start a business. And I know you're familiar with this, and probably many people that may be following this program are, but the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston did a study in, I think, 2015 or so, called The Color of Wealth.
Of course, yeah.
Which showed such a dramatic difference between the assets of African American households and white households in Greater Boston. They're in the process of redoing that study. Other research elsewhere in the country has reflected, similar kinds of racial wealth gaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that racial wealth gap, as it has developed over the last 100 years or so, is, as you said, a gap or a barrier to African Americans being able to buy homes, and also particularly it was a barrier to them buying homes in a place where the values might appreciate.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, which obviously is accelerating a lot in Boston.
Yeah.
And I know that before your work at Alston Brighton CDC, you were a tenant organizer.
I was a tenant organizer in Boston for about 4 years in the 1980s, and worked for an organization which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, the Massachusetts Tenants Organization, which was a statewide tenant organizing effort, and that was started by two really wonderful organizers, John McDonough and Lou Finfer. John McDonough went on to be an architect of important progressive healthcare legislation.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And Lou is out there still organizing. And it actually, I think the first time I was in the Acton area was in about 1984, 85. A apartment complex in Boxborough was facing a condominium conversion, and I remember going to a meeting of the tenants there who were trying to figure out how to fight the condominium conversion of their building in Boxborough. So we actually were organizing tenants statewide, and I think that's starting to happen again. Tenants here in Acton are organizing through Housing and Climate Justice for Acton.
Yep.
You've helped tenants in Ayer
organize,
and I think we can have a much more progressive housing policy at the state level if we have tenants organized around the state, not just in Boston and Cambridge or Somerville.
Absolutely. And tenant organizing, what was the tenant organizing? What was sort of the power that was trying to be leveraged when you first started out?
Well, in 1983, when I started doing tenant organizing in Massachusetts, there was a wave of condominium conversions that swept the state, and there were very few protections against evictions for the tenants who lived in those developments that were being converted to condominiums. So one of the early fights was to get statewide legislation that provided a notice period before people could get evicted for condominium conversion. In some ways, the fight about condominium conversion legislation was like some of the fights that you're engaged with right now, because communities passed condominium legislation that would restrict condominium conversions, but there was no state enabling authority, so people kept putting these home rule petitions to the legislature, and nothing was happening with the home rule petitions, and eventually the Mass Tenants Organization was able to work with Governor Dukakis to get statewide legislation enacted in the fall of 1983, which basically gave communities the right to regulate condominiums and established a statewide notice period for condominium conversions. So right now people are fighting to get real estate transfer taxes, and they're fighting to be able to go to ban gas hookups, and those things are home rule petitions that are being blocked at the state level, so similar kinds of dynamics. I think the general idea that we had was that if we had enough home rule petitions, there would be the political force to get it, and we did get that. We fought for just cause evictions as well, and I remember a vote in the state Senate in about 1984 or 5, a 19-18 vote on just cause eviction, and Senator Joe Timilty from Hyde Park, who was the chair of the Housing Committee, we thought he was on our side, but he voted against us, and that killed just cause eviction back in that era. But we also did a lot of work in kind of just doing building organizing. So when people were facing a condo conversion, they would get together and put pressure on the landlord to give them notice, to even when there wasn't a law to protect them at that point. And sometimes fighting rent increases as well, because rents were going up in the 1980s, even though the rents people paid seem almost comically low compared to what people are paying now. But another thing that we did, which is that we organized mobile home parks, and we actually won rent control for mobile home parks in Attleboro and a few other places around the state. And now, I mean, mobile home residents own their mobile home, but they don't own the land that it's on. So they're particularly vulnerable when someone buys the land and wants to build a mall or something else there.
Right, exactly.
And
I know the co-ops have tried to help some of those mobile home parks, that the residents own their own mobile park.
No, there's been a movement to try and create cooperatives, and that's happened in a number of places around the state, and that's one way that mobile home residents have fought back against displacement, and that's important too.
You were, I think, a few years ago, founded Acton Housing for All, one of the founders, is that right?
With Nancy Tavernier. Who, unfortunately,
housing legend.
Housing legend here in Acton, who unfortunately has moved on to be closer to her family on the West Coast. But I think we've had people trying to do good work on housing in Acton for some time, as you know. We've had a progressive housing authority that's done work to develop new affordable housing. We've had the Community Housing Corporation, which has supported a lot of affordable housing. But we decided about 5 years ago that we were not able to advocate the way that we really needed to in the community, and without a kind of an advocacy arm for our housing work. And so with the support of Citizens Housing and Planning Association, we built a volunteer advocacy organization that we've called Acton Housing for All. And the purpose has been to gather people who support an inclusive housing policies for the community, to be aware of the housing issues that are coming up in the town, and to spread the word and organize and support the creation of new affordable housing, and support policies that can make Acton a more inclusive place.
Absolutely, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of that advocacy, because I always say that even though I think a lot of residents think, yes, we need more affordable housing, or they're feeling the impact as well, even a lot of middle class families, the advocacy for it generally in the suburbs, at least in the district I represent, has not been particularly active. And if anything, when there is a proposal for denser housing or affordable housing, often local residents, neighbors come out quite forcefully against it.
Yeah, and that still happens here in Acton sometimes. And we don't win every battle, but I think the goal is to try and mobilize people who care about affordable housing and want inclusive housing policies. So I think our biggest victory in terms of the community's housing politics has been around the development of the parcel on Main Street as elderly and disabled housing.
Yes.
And so we were able to mobilize support for that proposal when it first came up for a decision at the town had created a committee to decide how the property should be disposed of, and what the appropriate path was, and people who supported affordable housing on the site came to the community meeting about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And when the straw vote was called for, the support was strong, and then 2 or 3 months later at town meeting, the support continued to be strong.
And I just remember that town meeting, because you're right. Often it's voices against public housing or affordable housing, and just person after person, seniors, young people, people with disabilities, speaking in support of the proposal.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. One of the things that has been, I guess, the subject of a lot of journalism and academic research is how decisions are made about housing in local communities, and how important it is for the people that support affordable housing to speak up early in the debate, and not be intimidated by someone who gets up and says, I'm an expert on this aspect of development or that aspect of development, and these developers clearly have not looked at this particular technical issue. So that, that happens often at these kinds of meetings, as you know.
Yes, and I think often that's the case. Is I find many public housing authorities, planning board staff are just maybe don't have the expertise or is focused on this, is what I've seen in Acton. It's really been very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a good town planning staff and a good housing authority, and they do a good job. I think that it's really important for people that are willing to support inclusive housing to speak up. I mean, I think one of the things that happens is the people that support the status quo are the people that are kind of empowered by our current system to have a voice. And that, I think, has skewed our local politics in almost every part of the country on these issues.
Absolutely.
Not just here in Massachusetts.
Absolutely. And they have the economic power, or they can hire lawyers or
Right.
form a neighborhood association,
Yep.
so-called, to oppose developments.
Yep, yep. And even when people have been willing to commit significant resources, like in Los Angeles, recently they adopted a provision that would commit several $billion to housing the homeless, and they've had tremendous difficulty in doing that because of of opposition from local neighborhoods, from what is sometimes called NIMBYism, not in my
Right.
backyardism.
Right, exactly. And in Acton, you mentioned the Main Street proposal. Right now, the ending construction somewhat of the Mass Ave,
Right.
Tavernier
Almost,
Place.
yep.
Yep, which is great to see.
Yep.
There's Habitat for Humanity house being
Uh-huh.
built. What else would you like to see here in Acton? What do we need to do?
I think it's time for us to do some new family housing. And I
Yes,
think
yeah.
that we've gotten two significant projects to serve elderly and disabled people, which is important.
Yep.
But I think we need to create new affordable housing for families. I mean, I think we've had several 40B developments that provide a range of apartments, and that's good. And one of the issues facing the community, as you are aware, is the new MBTA communities provision.
Sure,
That
yeah.
was part of the legislation that was adopted almost 2 years ago now.
Right, sort of the housing choice, yeah.
Right, the housing choice piece of the economic development package. So Acton, like I guess more than 100 other communities that are served by the MBTA, is the state has told us, if you want to continue to access resources that are important to building infrastructure in Acton, particularly the Mass Works program, which the town has utilized very effectively. If you want to continue to get Mass Works money, you need to create new zoning that will allow more multifamily housing to be created in Acton. So that's an important effort that the town is going to be undertaking, that we at Acton Housing for All need to support a vision of that. This is not the position of any organization as of now, but I think that we need to think about housing on the Kmart site. I think that's,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be just housing, but I think affordable housing should be a part of what happens on that site. And I think actually kind of knitting together the Kelly's Corner area, which is undergoing this infrastructure work now.
Right now.
Knitting that together so that we kind of have a vision of a future that connects that to the train station, and we have some additional bike lanes and maybe transit service between Kelly's Corner and the train station, and we, and there's some additional density at Kelly's Corner that would make sense, I think.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not necessarily a universal opinion, but
Yeah.
but
And you mentioned, forgive me, if you mentioned the state policy we changed, where it's talking about, okay, if a town or city is not going to embrace this denser housing near public transit or MBTA, that it would be at risk of not getting Mass Works.
That's right.
One of the things I want to highlight, and this is really where I give the Baker-Polito administration credit, is that they have prioritized already that a town or city will get a Mass Works grant if it's tied to housing.
Right.
There was the proposed Powder Mill Apartments at the Acton-Maynard border. Obviously, it's still uncertain when that development will happen.
Right.
But there was a $2 million sewer infrastructure that, again, is not just going to help that development, but the businesses in that whole area. And then sort of hot off the press when this airs is that this week the administration provided a $2.3 million sewer grant for the Main Street public housing, which is fantastic.
Right,
So
that's really great news for the project and for the town.
Yeah, so that's something that myself, Rep. Sina, and Rep. Gouveia advocated for. But I think you make a good point, is that if we're really going to be serious about denser housing and multifamily housing, you need that stronger standard and really that stronger stick, if you will, to get this housing built in communities.
Yeah, and I'd also like to, before we end, I just wanted to kind of compliment the Acton Select Board for taking a step to support tenants in Acton with a $30,000 commitment to a tenant advocacy program for Acton. And I think it's wonderful that a number of tenants in Acton have become organized over the last year and a half, have spoken up, have said, one of the things we need is help dealing with conditions in our buildings, help dealing, and the Select Board has listened, and I think the town is working hard to figure out how to serve those people better, and I think that's really important as well.
Absolutely, and I think oftentimes, elected officials or sort of the middle class or homeowners don't think about the fact that all too often, tenants, whether because of their economic circumstances, whether because, they might be moving around more often, generally are not contacting legislators or sort of have that political power that homeowners do, and therefore that directly translates into housing policy and so many other policies.
Right.
So I agree. I praise the Select Board and obviously the tenants that advocated for that, and that is also part of the Acton Housing for All agenda, if you will.
Yes, and finally, well, I don't know how much time we have left, but I think it's important to know that that housing has got to be part of our climate solution as well, and so we need to decarbonize the buildings that we live in, and we also need to make it possible for people to decarbonize their transportation by allowing EV charging in multifamily buildings, and by supporting public transit and better bike and pedestrian access. And I know, that's a priority that we got at least a advisory question adopted at town meeting last spring about EV charging and trying to change zoning to require that new multifamily construction have EV charging infrastructure built as part of it. And I think it's important to support the town's efforts to decarbonize multifamily buildings as well, because we have lots of programs to push solar and air source heat pumps for homeowners, but we need to do it for multifamily as well.
Right, it needs to be intersectional, and that's a great final point. And the final point I'll make is that I do have this legislation. You're familiar with the Housing Environment Revenue Opportunities Act, HERO Act, that would fund both climate resiliency but also affordable housing. So, appreciate all of your work throughout your career, and thanks so much for coming on the show. And thank you for those who are watching Half Hour on the Hill. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge here with Bob Van Meter, the chair of Acton Housing for All, and thanks so much for joining us.